I would like to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us today as we come together on this annual Day of Remembrance. The Jewish Holocaust Remembrance Day, also called Yom Hashoah, was originally established by the Israeli government in 1953 as a day for the citizens of Israel to remember those murdered during the Holocaust. It is a solemn day, beginning at sunset of the 27th of the Hebrew month of Nisan and ending the following evening, which will be tonight, according to the traditional Jewish custom of marking a day. Over the past decades, Yom HaShoah has become a day commemorated by Jewish communities and individuals worldwide. In cities around the globe, many gather to read aloud the names of Jews and other victims of Nazi persecution killed in the Holocaust. Our Elon community has joined this tradition to emphasize the depth of loss by reading the names of Holocaust victims from the steps of the Mosley Center. You're all invited to participate in this act of remembrance by joining us following this service for the reading of names of those who perished in the Shoah on the steps of Mosley, which we're going to have from 11 till 3 this afternoon. This morning, however, we want to connect and share a few moments of reflection to commemorate the lives of those who died as a result of the racial purity measures in German-controlled Europe during World War II, and will remind the public of the terrible deeds that can be carried out when bigotry, hatred, and indifference are regarded as normal. Following the Yizkor, Elon students, faculty, and staff will be reading personal accounts and recollections of Jewish victims of the Holocaust, some who perished, some who survived. Before we light candles, share a few personal reflections, including a piano and dance performance, and then end our ceremony with the mourner's Kaddish. This moment would also be a great time to check that your cell phones are turned off as we begin. And I'm handing over to Rabbi Klaus.
In the rising of the sun and in its going down, we remember them. In the blowing of the wind and in the chill of winter, we remember them. In the opening of the buds and in the rebirth of spring, we remember them. In the blueness of the sky and in the warmth of summer, we remember them. In the rustling of leaves and in the beauty of autumn, we remember them. In the beginning of the year and when it ends, we remember them. When we are weary and in need of strength, we remember them. When we are lost and sick at heart, we remember them. When we have joys we yearn to share, we remember them. So long as we live, they too shall live, for they are now a part of us as we remember them. El Malei Rachamim, Shochein Bamromim, Hamtzeh Menucha Nechona, Tachat Kanfei Ashchina, B'malo Kedoshim Utorim, Kezoar Harakia Mazhirim, Et Nishmot Kol Ele Shemasru Ad Nafsham Al Kiddush Hashem, V'shenehergu Vashoah, Ana Baharachamim, Tasdirem B'tel Knafecha L'Olamim, Utzror B'tzrachim Et Nishmotam, V'yanuchu v'shalom al mishkavam, v'nomar Amen.
The Holocaust, Shoah, is the term for the murder of about 6 million Jews by the Nazi regime and their collaborators during the Second World War. Between 1941 and 1945, the Nazis sought to eliminate the entire Jewish community of Europe. Jews were murdered by death squads called Einsatzgruppen or transported to extermination camps. 6 million of the 11 million European Jews perished. The Holocaust mainly occurred in Eastern Europe, in places such as Poland and Ukraine. The term Holocaust can also refer to the orchestrated murder of Roma. Other groups were also targeted by the Nazi regime. Disabled people, Soviet prisoners of war and civilians, Polish civilians, homosexuals, socialists, communists, and trade unionists, Freemasons, and Jehovah's Witnesses. The Nazis did not act alone. Countries which were occupied by the Nazis during the Second World War, such as Lithuania and the Ukraine, assisted the perpetrators. To gain an understanding of the Holocaust, it is important to look not only at the acts of the perpetrators, but at the experiences of victims and survivors. And even though it is impossible to truly understand the victims' experiences, and even though nothing can prepare us to encounter the horror of this crime, it is still important to take stock of the scope of this genocide and to understand how millions of people were deprived of humanity.
Every year, we choose to focus on one group persecuted during the Holocaust to create a more in-depth understanding of their particular experiences during that time. This year, inspired by the words of the historian of the Warsaw Ghetto, Emanuel Ringelblum, we dedicate this memorial service to all of the women of valor. In one of his writings recorded after the Germans invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, he wrote, "The future historian will have to dedicate an appropriate page to the Jewish women in the war. She will take up an important page in Jewish history for her courage and steadfastness. By her merit, thousands of families have managed to surmount the terror of the times." We will recount some of their unique experiences before we light candles for all the victims that perished during the Holocaust and offer personal reflections.
The fate of Stefania Wilczynska, Lili Kastischer, Anna Ventura, Yehudit Aufrichtig, and Hannah Senesh represent different stories from that time. While their personal situation varied and they lived in different places in Europe, their actions during the years of persecution had a common thread. They cared for others and tried to keep hope alive for those who depended on them. Our students will introduce their stories. Come forward.
Stefania Wilczynska, the deputy of the Jewish orphanage director, Dr. Janusz Korczak, was born in 1886 in Poland. She completed her studies at the University of Liege, Belgium. In 1909, she met Dr. Janusz Korczak and the two formed a bond and since then ran an orphanage in Warsaw, which housed some 150 children. In 1935, she visited the land of Israel and lived in Ein Harod until 1939. With the Nazi occupation, the members of Ein Harod arranged for Stefania to leave Poland, but she declined and instead moved to the Warsaw Ghetto along with Dr. Korczak and the children.
Date, 2nd April, 1940. My dear, we are well. I work a little at the orphanage while Korczak is doing a great deal. I have not arrived because I do not want to leave without the children. Yours, Stefania.
On the 5th of August, 1942, the order to deport the orphans was handed down. Stefania, Dr. Korczak, and the other staff members marched with the 192 orphans to the Umschlagplatz. With Stefania in charge of the group of 9 to 12-year-old children, they were transported together with the children to the gas chambers of Treblinka. All were murdered.
I had only one object in mind, to encourage the Jewish women there not to give up, not to be discouraged, not to be pessimistic, but to hold on.
These are the words of Lily Kastisha, who was born in 1923 in Novi Sad, Yugoslavia. She was deported from Hungary to Auschwitz at the age of 21, following her capture during resistance operations. From Auschwitz, she was sent to Camp Oberhohenelbe in Sudetenland. Once every 2 weeks on Sundays, the women were given time to tend to their personal hygiene, wash their clothes, and treat their lice. On these occasions, Lily organized afternoon cultural events in which about 20 women participated. They held a painting, poetry, and short story writing contest. They built a stage of boxes, performed recitations and skits, conducted debates, created sculptures out of potatoes, set their poems to melodies, sang songs, and dreamed about the liberation. The works were numbered so as not to expose their creator's identity. Lily Kastisha survived the Holocaust, as did most of the women in her camp group, and emigrated to Israel in 1948, carrying her friends' drawings and poems that she had once concealed in her blouse. She died in 1973.
24th February, 1944. My very dear ones, my spirits are very high. We will see each other soon. Lots of kisses to all of you. All of my thoughts are of you. Nina. This is from Anna Ventura's last postcard.
This postcard was written on the deportation train that left the Fucili camp in Italy for Auschwitz on the 22nd of February, 1944. It was thrown from the cattle car on the 24th of February as it crossed the border between Italy and Austria. The author was an Italian Jew, Anna Ventura, who wrote the words, "Please send this postcard by mail," on the postcard in the hope that someone would find it. Fearing that the secret police may not allow the postcard to reach its destination if they thought that it had been thrown from a train of Jews being sent to their death, Anna used a common Christian name, Nina, as that of the sender. She gave Bolzano, a city on the Austro-German border, as the sender's address, to offer a clue as to where she was being transported. The postcard contained her last words. For a long time, the family, her mother, husband, and 4 children, only 3 of whom survived in hiding until the end of World War II, held on to the faint hope that they would see her again. Later, they learned the bitter truth. On the 26th of February, 1944, following a 5-day journey, the train arrived at Auschwitz. Of the 650 Jews deported, 521 Jews were murdered on the day of their arrival at the camp, and Anna Ventura was among them. Few survived until the end of the war.
Born in Hungary in 1914, Yehudit immigrated to Amsterdam in 1938 and worked as a nanny for a Jewish family. At the time of the German occupation, she was studying to be a beautician. In this capacity, she met the wife of the Hungarian ambassador to the Netherlands, who supplied her with a passport that did not identify her as a Jew. Yehudit became a member of the resistance, distributing foraged ration cards and food to Jewish families who were hiding on Dutch farms. Betrayed by a Dutch woman, she was deported in 1944 to Westerbork and on to Ravensbrück, where she was put to work in a Siemens factory. She and her friends wrote fantasy recipes and supported each other during this difficult time. For example, one day, Yehudit was ill and missed the distribution of the daily slice of bread. Her friend Edith Gumbus brought her the bread along with the following letter.
Dear Julie, I'm very sorry that we didn't spend the day together in our lovely hall and didn't have our meals together. To allow you to get at least some mental pleasure from our meals, I'll give you the details of the menu. Breakfast, Carlsbad-style breakfast, eggs, butter, cheese, jam. Brunch, at 10 o'clock we had yogurt, langouste, a deep-fried yeast pastry, and a radish. Lunch, potato soup with sour cream and laurel leaves, asparagus and sour cream and breadcrumbs, sunny-side-up egg and beef and tomato sauce with macaroni, fried apple and vanilla sauce. Afternoon, chocolate milk with whipped cream and egg bread with almonds and a hornet's nest, a type of cake. Supper, marrow, fried potatoes with onion, salad with green onion, little cookies, and black coffee, fruit. We gorged ourselves with klari. We ate everything apart from a little slice of bread, which we saved for you.
As the war came to a close, Yehudit joined the Bernadette convoy and reached Sweden. She died in Israel in 2003.
Born in Budapest, Hannah Senesh became a Zionist and immigrated to Palestine in 1939. In 1943, Jewish agency officials asked Senesh to join a clandestine military operation. She became a member of the Palmach and participated in a course for paratroopers. In March 1944, she was dropped into Yugoslavia in order to aid anti-Nazi forces. Senesh was captured in June after entering Hungary and went to a prison in Budapest, where she was tortured. Since Senesh would not talk, Hungarian authorities arrested her mother. Both women remained silent. Given the chance to beg for a pardon in November 1944, Senesh chose death by firing squad. One of her poems, A Walk to Sisera, was set to music.
We now invite you to commemorate the victims of the Holocaust as we light candles to remember those who perished, those who supported the victims of Nazi persecution or liberated the survivors. We light our candles by passing the light of memory and hope from one to another. Let us honor those whose lights were put out, whose dreams, hopes, and lives were snuffed out before they even lived, for the 1.5 million children. We light a candle for the untold millions for whom there is no one to mourn, whose entire families were annihilated, and whose lie in unmarked graves. We light a candle for those who stood upright while others were bending to immoral will, for the righteous among the nations who risked and even gave up their lives to help their fellow human beings. We light a candle for those brave soldiers who liberated the camps, who carried the dead and near dead in their arms to a kinder and more humane future, and for those who served with the Allied forces to put an end to tyranny and oppression. We light a candle for the nearly 6 million Jews and for the 5 million non-Jews who perished in a planned system of human destruction, the scale of which had never been before even imagined. We light a candle for those who live even now under the yoke of oppression in places where the threat of genocide is real and ever present.
In her senior year of high school, Lauren Weinberg spent 1 week in Poland and 1 week in Israel on a program called the March of the Living. She had the opportunity to visit several concentration camps. Lauren was able to understand what it meant to be part of the Jewish religion and the Jewish people. This dance represents her personal experience.
Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp, that turned my life into one long night 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget that smoke. Never shall I forget the small faces of the children whose bodies I saw transformed into smoke under a silent sky. Never shall I forget those flames that consumed my faith forever. Never shall I forget the nocturnal silence that deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments that murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams into ashes. Never shall I forget those things, even where I condemned to live. As long as God Himself, never. They left us without a trace, and we are their trace.
Thank you, Laura. Just a quick programming note. We are running slightly late. We really want to hear Melissa and Gray tell us about the experience on their last journey, and we will end with the Mourner's Kaddish by Rabbi Clausen. After a pause of 2 years, Elon University was again able to send students on the Holocaust journey study abroad. We invited Melissa Danish and Gray Ost, who participated this year, to share their personal reflections and experiences with us today.
Going on the Holocaust journey was one of the best decisions of my life. I began learning about the Holocaust from a young age, meeting survivors when I was young as 8 years old. And I'd been to many Holocaust memorial museums. But going to the actual sites provided a new perspective. With 27 peers and 2 professors, I traveled to Poland, Germany, and the Czech Republic. I visited the Warsaw Ghetto and Treblinka, where Stefania Wilczynska, Dr. Jan Karsak, and their orphan children perished. I visited Auschwitz-Birkenau, where Alice Kostitcher and Anna Ventura suffered at the hands of the Nazi regime. And I bore witness to the Jews, homosexuals, political opponents, Roma, and others who were murdered in Theresienstadt, the Krakow Ghetto, Majdanek, and Buchenwald. While this was certainly heavy information, I found myself more fascinated by one thing: bravery. I was stunned by the courage and valor of the survivors, and I was particularly taken by the story of the Czech and Slovak airmen of the Parachutist Church. These brave men, as young as 21 and 22 years old, courageously risked their lives to assassinate Reinhard Heydrich to protect the freedom of their country. For background, Reinhard Heydrich was the 3rd highest ranking Nazi official at the time, in charge of Nazi actions in Bohemia and Moravia. He also was largely responsible for the final solution, or the plan to murder the entire European Jewry. 2 brave soldiers, Jan Kubis and Josef Gabsik, succeeded in killing Hendrik. These men, along with the other parachuters, hid in the crypt of the Cathedral Church of Saints Cyril and Methodius in Prague. After they were betrayed by one of their own, and the Gestapo surrounded the church, several of these brave soldiers opened fire. The Nazis flooded the crypt with water, and the remaining resistance members committed suicide. I hadn't known this story previous to visiting the crypt of the church itself. It was a small, eerie concrete dungeon with slots in the wall for ancient corpses of the church clergy, in some ways foreshadowing the future. It was dark, except for the remembrance candle. Most notably, there were statues commemorating each parachuter around the small room. In reading their stories, I was horrified by how young they were. Some were my age, but they still volunteered on this dangerous mission despite the obvious dangers. I am humbled to have even walked in the same room as them, regardless of the nearly 80 years in between us. These brave men helped save countless men, women, and children that were being persecuted, and along with the courageous women that we've previously mentioned in the service, I learned that love, bravery, sacrifice, and valor will persist in even the worst circumstances. While I may never understand how the Holocaust happened or why, I gained a sense of relief that good people will always fight against genocide and oppression. Whenever you feel hopeless, I implore you to read about these impressive acts of resistance, to find light in the darkest of times, to find meaning in what seems meaningless. Thank you.
First off, I would like to thank the coordinators of this event for allowing me to speak before you all today. In short, the Holocaust journey has shaped the way I view my life and has helped rekindle my own faith. The Holocaust Journey J-Torm course was a 3-week course around Europe. We explored 3 different countries, visited 5 different concentration camps, while constantly reminding ourselves and being reminded of the 6 million individuals who lost their lives during this global tragedy. We visited 5 camps during our time in Europe: Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, Majdanek, Treblinka, and Buchenwald. They each have their own stories, their own futures, and their own pasts. There were 3 instances on this journey that stuck out in my head and I vividly remember. During our first concentration camp visit to Theresienstadt, we were given the time to walk freely throughout the grounds within the camp, within the barracks, and a monument to honor an escape attempt that took place. While walking through the barracks, I noticed an engraving that was nameless and had faded over the last, give or take, 80 years. The engraving was of an etched Star of David into a bed frame. This struck a strong chord with me. I saw many of these etchings wherever we went and wherever we saw barracks, at Theresienstadt, Auschwitz, and Majdanek. The Stars of David in the bed frames followed. I remember telling the group sitting on the ground of a lobby in our hotel that how can I say it's difficult to get up and go to church? How can I say it's difficult to find God during our own time? As for the people in the camps, everything could have been taken away. They were stripped down, their clothes taken, their blankets had been taken, their will had been taken, but their faith would not be. That would not be taken away. Also at Theresienstadt came my second moment where I was reminded of my why. Outside of the camp, there were 2 large monuments, a cross and a Star of David, to honor those who had died in the camp, and even after liberation. In between these monuments, there were rows of rectangular headstones honoring the deceased. The stones that stood out for me were not only the ones with names, but those without. The headstones that were without the names were just presented by numbers. Those numbers have a history, with families, with potential grandchildren, and their own life stories, but it had been reduced to 3 numbers. The first one I saw was number 268. Those 3 numbers have a story that may not be remembered by passers-by, but should never be forgotten. Lastly, the gas chambers, specifically at Auschwitz. Seeing the implants of fingernails scraping the wall, attempting to escape, images of crosses etched into the wall, and seeing the remnants of the Zyklon B still staining the walls and ceiling in eerie blue 80 years later. Following our visit to Auschwitz, I recall sitting down and talking with Dr. Landsberg and Dr. Gaither and saying that we might have been one of the few to walk into the gas chamber and actually walk out. That was our why. We went to those camps to experience and learn and come back to share those experiences. The trip would have been for nothing if we'd returned to our homes and did not share and remind and inform those around us of what we saw, so that we as a society and a people do not forget these atrocities.
Thank you both. I would like to invite Rabbi Clausen to end our ceremony with the Monas Kaddish. We must remember so that it will not happen again. Thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome to rise if you wish, and welcome to join with me. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbah v'yalma divrach yirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chayachon u'yomechon u'chaye dechol Beit Yisrael b'agala u'vizman kari v'imru amen. Yehei shemei Rabbah mevarach le'olam olmei olmaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yit'aleh v'yit'halal shmei dekudsha brechu le'ela min kol berchata v'shirata Tushbechata v'nechamata ta'amiran bi'alma v'yemru amen. Yehi shlama rabba min shemaya v'chaim alenu v'al kol Yisrael v'yemru amen. Oseh shalom b'mramav hu yaseh shalom alenu v'al kol Yisrael v'al kol Yoshvei Tevel v'yemru amen.